Welcome to Lecture 15 for Philosophy of the Natural Sciences. This is going to be an atypical lecture for us. Normally, you'll read through the material, complete the lecture, then post your reply to the 1-minute argument question. But for the short week that we have, what I want to do is a little different. So I'd like for you to complete the lecture before you listen to the podcast with this interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Because within that interview ends up saying some, not so flattering things about philosophy and the relation between philosophy and science. And what I want to do here in this lecture is to sort of set the stage for that, as well as for the critical pieces I want you to read that sort of take Tyson to task for what he ends up claiming and the reasons that he gives in the interview. And then in the end, I want you to decide what view do you think is more reasonable and to sort of defend a critical evaluation of a view with which you disagree, to show why it's fallacious or unreasonable, because, as I say at the very end here, these are among the things that I'm going to want you to do in your essay for me for this course. So let's just remind ourselves that we've been dealing with the relation between philosophy and science since the beginning of this course on Philosophy of the Natural Sciences. And one of the first slides that you saw way back when in the lecture, What is Philosophy of Science?, was this quote from Bertrand Russell. And I like the quote, and I'm not going to read through the whole thing again, because Russell sets off philosophy as something different than either theology or religion and science. And I like the way this ends when he says that philosophy is neither science nor theology, but it's exposed to attack from both sides. And in that no man's land between the two, well, that's what philosophy is. And I think he's absolutely right about a couple of things. One is that, philosophy ain't religion. It's not theology, nor is philosophy science. You can't do philosophy if you're doing science, because, as you now understand better, the methodology for doing philosophy and doing science are two different things. So philosophy is not science. No one's really claiming that it is. And in the course of this semester, you've discovered that, according to me, doing philosophy requires two things. And the first is that you need to attempt to resolve the right sort of question. And by that I mean, as I've characterized it, fundamental questions, that is, open questions, questions about the meaning, truth, and logical relations among our ideas, our concepts, our beliefs, our assumptions, our explanations, and our theories. And that covers quite a bit of ground. But in the end, you can't do philosophy unless you're dealing with the right sort of question. And the right sorts of questions, in order to make them fundamental ones or philosophical ones, is they can never be empirical questions. That is, a question that you can resolve through observation alone or by conducting some experiment or collecting data. Those are, in principle, not fundamental questions. And you saw in the course of time that fundamental questions have a number of features. And one of them is that good reasons often can be given for different answers to a specific fundamental question, and that the job of the philosopher is very often trying to determine what's most reasonable to believe about these various views that can be held and maintained with respect to the specific question. Now, the specific questions that philosophers deal with, that is, these fundamental questions, as you've discovered, end up breaking up philosophy into the various subfields of philosophy, because fundamental question can be a logical one, it can be a metaphysical one, it can be an epistemological one, it can be an ethical one, and so on. And I've already established, I think, that these kinds of questions don't just crop up in academic departments of philosophy at colleges and universities. That rather, these questions are ubiquitous. I mean, they're like McDonald's. They're everywhere. And scientists deal with these kinds of questions too. And in the end, sometimes scientists end up doing some philosophy. And that's not surprising, given that we have that degree called PhD, which means Doctor of Philosophy. And, there are folks outside of the academic departments of philosophy that deal with fundamental questions and use reason in the attempt to resolve them, which leads to the second requirement here. But the point is, doing philosophy requires dealing with a certain kind of question. So questions matter to the very practice of doing philosophy. And so too does the use of reason. You're not doing philosophy if you're trying to persuade people by force or tradition or revelation or authority. Rather, you have to use reason in the attempt to determine what's most reasonable to believe. So again, the first requirement, you have to be dealing with the right sort of question. The second requirement is you have to be using reason in the attempt to resolve it, not conducting an experiment, not simply collecting data. Those empirical methods lie at the very heart of hypothesis testing in science. I mean, that's, part of the defining feature of what makes a science a science. So you're not doing philosophy if you're conducting experiments. It's not that there may not be philosophical implications to the experiment. The point is that we settle issues in philosophy and in science in different ways. And one of the ways in which we use a reason in order to settle or try to determine what's most reasonable to believe about these fundamental questions will be through critical thinking. And one of the things that we do when we're thinking critically, and hopefully well, is asking relevant and interesting questions. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of good reasoning. So doing philosophy requires not just dealing with fundamental questions. We're asking questions in the process of trying to resolve fundamental questions. Like, what do you mean by that? What conditions must be met for something to be a planet, for instance? Is blank true, and so on. But you also discovered that the main means through which philosophers use reason to settle fundamental questions will be through arguments, or sometimes conceptual analysis, but arguments. And an argument, as you know, consists of a claim and at least one reason given in order to show that the claim is true. So in this semester, we've spent some time talking about statements, because ultimately arguments are made up of statements. And you're learning some useful things to know when your job is to recognize an argument, because making a claim is easy. Anyone can make any claim they want at any time. The hard part is giving good reasons which collectively show that the claim is true. So the point is, doing philosophy requires not just dealing with the right sort of question. We use questions in the attempt to determine what's most reasonable to believe, because that's one of the hallmarks of reason. And so too are arguments. So we've talked about all of this before. I'm just sort of reviewing some stuff. But the reason I'm doing this is because, well, there is a difference between philosophy and science. And I didn't try to be exhaustive in this particular list here, but basically you can't do philosophy unless you're dealing with the right sort of question, and these questions can never be empirical ones. It's not that empirical questions or data don't bear upon the arguments that we make in philosophy. They do. It's just that you can never settle a fundamental question by simply collecting data, recording observations, or performing an experiment. Those are empirical questions, and empirical questions are not the same thing as fundamental questions. And I say that, in order to solve or to settle or to determine what's most reasonable to believe with respect to a fundamental question, you got to use reason, not force, not appeal to tradition, not faith. And it's not that, well, only philosophers reason. Scientists reason too. They have to reason through, well, for instance, the identification of the hypothesis that they want to test. They have to predict what observation they ought to observe should the hypothesis be true. I mean, there's a logic to hypothesis testing, among other things, and all that requires reason as well. But basically, there are some differences between philosophy and science, whereas it's the reasonableness of a particular argument that's going to matter, which will require identifying the logical structure of the argument and evaluating, say, whether it's cogent. It's falsifiability, as you've discovered, that's really the hallmark of science, and the reasonableness of what goes on in science. And there are some other things that we could identify as well, and one common feature in philosophy as well as science is fallibility. If, for instance, we were God, and we had this point of view that allowed us to say, these are the statements that are true, and those are the ones that are false, well, then we'd be God, and we'd know everything. But as Quine puts it elsewhere, there is no cosmic exile. There's no privileged place to go in the universe where we can say, those are all the true things, and those are all the false things. Sometimes, for good reasons, we're mistaken. We're misled through the evidence or the empirical procedure to believe that something's the case when it isn't. But we don't, when we discover this, throw up our hands and start tearing out our hair, thinking, cats are going to be sleeping with dogs and whatnot. Rather, we discover that something that we had possibly good reasons to believe in turned out to be false. So the rational thing to do is to give that up. And the history of science is littered with bodies of theories that were the best things to believe at their time. Not just bodies, but claims. Certain assumptions about the way the world is. And if you go back through the history of philosophy, there are lots of things that philosophers do not believe today that philosophers believed even a century ago or a couple of centuries ago. So the point is, none of us is perfect. No method is perfect. And we may discover in the course of time a better instrument or a better argument that might lead us to believe that what we now hold to be true is something different. The point is, there are differences, and if I had to pick out the one difference between philosophy and science, it has to do with the kinds of questions that philosophers deal with. And I'm emphasizing this question business quite a bit because in the interview that Neil deGrasse Tyson gives in that podcast, he ends up saying, as you've discovered already, some rather unflattering things about philosophy, but in particular it has to do with how philosophers do what they do and the role that questions play in the very practice of philosophy. So here's an image of Neil deGrasse Tyson. I find it almost impossible to believe that you haven't seen this guy someplace before. He's everywhere. He's not very old, 1958, American astrophysicist. He's the director of the Hayden Planetarium, and he's authored quite a number of books. I'm not going to read through the list. You can, see those if you look him up on Wikipedia. So this is the guy, and you've probably seen him on one of the several series that he's hosted. So he used to host Nova Science Now. From 2006 to 2011, that was a PBS program. Then Star Talk on NPR, which he continues to host. And then recently, in 2014, there was a remake of the original Carl Sagan series called Cosmos. Carl Sagan, hallowed be his name. And it's quite entertaining. So you've seen him possibly through one of these episodes that he's hosted, or he routinely appears on a number of programs, The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, Real Time with Bill Maher, among others. He's often used as an expert, and justifiably so, for matters related to science education, legislation. He is, without a doubt, probably the face of science and one of the strongest advocate for science education in the United States today. But that doesn't mean that, because of his authority with respect to science, that we should simply defer to him. But the thing is, he's got an audience, which is undeniable. And again, he does some marvelous things, but it doesn't mean everything that comes out of his mouth is going to be marvelous. So among the things that he's done, besides the things that he's hosted, besides the interviews that he routinely gives, he did this particular interview, which is a podcast for the Nerdist, which is, most of them are marvelous. And this particular episode is episode 489. So within iTunes, if you access the material via your iOS device, you'll find links to this episode, to this podcast. And if you're accessing it through UNO, through Moodle, I've got links to all of the material in the 1 minute argument question here. But here's the idea. In this particular interview, Tyson ends up saying, as I've already said, some very unflattering things about philosophy. He makes some claims. Maybe not all of his reasons are explicit, but he's certainly making some assumptions. And I don't know if you've ever watched an episode of The Big Bang Theory, but one of the characters, and Tyson's been on that series too. And one of the characters, he's got some difficulty when it comes to sort of social skills and recognizing people's emotional states and desires, and he's very selfish. None of this has anything to do with science. It just has to do with Asperger's syndrome. But he's a theoretical physicist, and he routinely, over the several years of the series, routinely bashes every other discipline, even, like, for instance, applied physicists. Well, they're not doing real science, the really important stuff, because that's all the theoretical science. And then the things that particular character in The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon, has to say about biology, well, that's just the ucky, meat stuff. I mean, that's just not very interesting. So basically, I'm not saying that Tyson is putting science above everything else, but there's a sense in which he is. And he's coming across sort of very elitist, as if the only kinds of questions that matter are the kinds of questions that scientists deal with, and the only way for dealing with those questions, which seem to be the only interesting ones, are the way that scientists deal with questions. And that's sort of the issue here, since there is a fundamental difference between how philosophy is done versus how science is done. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to listen to the episode. The entire episode's a little over an hour long. What he has to say about philosophy, if I remember right, begins around 20 minutes or so. But an hour long is consistent with the typical lectures that we have for this course. So if you want to listen to the whole thing, and I encourage you to do that, then listen to the whole thing. But what I want you to do while you're listening to it is to focus on what he has to say specifically about philosophy. Now, I'm not going to go through and reconstruct his arguments, that is, identify the claims that he makes, identify the reasons that he gives for his claims, and then to evaluate them. That's what I want you to do. In the end, I want you to take a stand on whether you think the arguments that he's making are reasonable, or the arguments of his critics are reasonable. So as you're listening to the podcast, I want you to pay attention to the claims he makes about the discipline of philosophy, about philosophical questions and the role questions play in doing philosophy, about the usefulness of the major, about the value of philosophy to science, or the relation between philosophy and science. And if you disagree with him, well, you need to identify not just the claim, but the reason that he gives for it, because a claim by itself is not an argument. But in addition to the podcast where the interview occurs with Tyson, I also want you to, well, again, like I've said, reconstruct the arguments. So what claim does he make? What evidence or assumptions does he offer as evidence? And in the end, I want you to assess to evaluate whether his arguments are reasonable. But besides Tyson's claims, I also want you to consider some claims by some critics of Tyson who wrote some short things. These aren't very long. Links to which I've all supplied, either through iTunes U, through the post, or through the Moodle. You'll see all the links here. But basically, Tyson and his critics can't both be right. And the critics take Tyson to task not just for the claims, right, but for the reasons that he gives for his claims. And again, there's a critical thinking exercise involved here. I want you to identify the claims, identify the reasons given for the claims. That is, what evidence or assumptions are they making for them, and are the arguments reasonable? They're all guys, so I'm saying his here. But as I just said, both Tyson and his critics can't both be right. So this is a rather wordy slide to see, but this is word for word with what you'll see when you get to the 1 minute argument question on Moodle. So I say that both Tyson and his critics can't all be right about the value or lack thereof of philosophy. Suppose I'm on the fence, that is me, and I'm a rational audience. I'm willing to be persuaded on the basis of reason alone. What I want you to do is to take a stand. So defend the view that you think is more reasonable in order to persuade me to get off the fence. That is, with respect to the value of philosophy, either Tyson's or anti-philosophy arguments or the critics' pro-philosophy arguments. I say here that this is still just a 1 minute argument, so I'm not expecting or wanting, in fact, for you to write an essay. Hence, I simply want you to pick a claim that is made, identify some reasons that are given in support of it, and to present that argument as your opponent's position, that is, a view with which you disagree. And you'll need to give me a fair and accurate reconstruction of that view. Don't set it up as a straw man. Try as best as you can to give this view with which you disagree. It could be Tyson's view. It could be one of the critics' view. And then I say, I want you to then to show that it is fallacious or otherwise unreasonable. And you've learned a fair amount of stuff about logic and evaluating arguments in order to be able to do that. I say that if you are to be persuasive, then you cannot simply focus on the claim your opponent makes. Instead, you must address the evidence or the reasons your opponent gives for his claim, even if it seems to be only presupposed but not stated explicitly. And I say here that this is not simply an exercise in critical thinking. Rather, reconstructing an argument with which you disagree and showing why it is unreasonable are two things that you'll be required to do in your essay for me, when you actually write a real essay. Because I want to, as you can tell from the guidelines, I want it literally broken up into specific sections. I'll be looking for different kinds of information in each of the sections. And one of the sections, section 3, you'll have to reconstruct the argument, the view with which you disagree, and then in the next section, show why it's unreasonable. So while you listen to the interview, and then while you read through the critics of Tyson as a result of what he says in the interview, I want you to come to some sense of, well, whose view do you think is more reasonable? And I want you to try to persuade me, at least with respect to, an argument made either by Tyson or one of the critics, and where you disagree with that argument. So you need to give me some evidence to show why they're wrong. If we get out of this and we go into Moodle quickly, once you click on the 1 minute argument question for this material, I'm not going to read through all this, but I basically sort of say here in a paragraph what it is I've been lecturing about here. I've got links to the podcast plus the pieces by the critics, and again, they're short, only a page or a couple pages. You can even read through the comments that people posted on, and some of these are blogs, in order to sort of position yourself as sort of a participant in this discussion. But I don't want you to give me a couple of lines like a commenter would. Instead, I want it to be a little bit more reasonable, so I'm expecting a couple of paragraphs. Minimally, there'll be a paragraph reconstructing an argument that so-and-so makes, and then your paragraph showing why it's unreasonable. And in order to reply, what you'll have to do is click on the assignment down here. And by the way, this paragraph here is word for word identical with that last slide in the PowerPoint. You'll click on assignment, and then you'll see that same paragraph, word for word identical. You're not going to be able to see anyone else's reply until you post one of your own. So this is a little different week, and this is by far the shortest lecture you're going to have from me, but it is in this course. But I wanted to do things a little differently here for a couple of reasons. Normally I like to show movies or TV episodes, and I was going to show an episode of Cosmos, but given that the podcast itself, that interview is about an hour long, I decided just to focus on the podcast, the critical evaluations of it, and then in the end for you to determine what you think is more reasonable to believe, and to play a role here in this debate about the controversy that Tyson stirred up by the interview. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to email me or to give me a call or arrange a time for us to chat. And this is the end of the lecture.